It was a chilly evening in the city, with people hurrying to get home, wrapping their coats tightly around themselves to shield against the biting wind. Streetlights flickered on as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the sidewalks. Among the bustling crowd, a little boy no older than 7 wandered aimlessly, his small hands trembling as he clutched his backpack. His eyes, wide with fear, scanned the unfamiliar streets, hoping to recognize something, anything, that would lead him home. "Excuse me," he murmured, tugging at the sleeve of a passing businessman, but the man barely spared him a glance before striding away. The boy's throat tightened. He was lost, completely and utterly lost. A few feet away, an old homeless man sat on the cold pavement, wrapped in a tattered blanket. His beard was unkempt, and his face bore the marks of hardship, but his eyes held a certain gentleness. He had been watching the boy for a few minutes now, noticing the way he hesitated at every street corner, the way he nervously bit his lip. The man knew that look. It was the same look he had worn many years ago when he had lost everything and found himself wandering the streets, unsure of where to go next. Clearing his throat, the homeless man spoke, his voice rough but kind. "Hey kid, you look lost." The boy flinched but turned to face him. There was a moment of hesitation. His parents had always warned him about talking to strangers, but desperation won over caution. "I am," he admitted in a small voice. "I was supposed to wait for my dad, but I walked too far, and now I don't know where I am." The homeless man nodded in understanding. "All right, don't worry. Tell me where you were supposed to meet your dad, and I'll help you find your way back." Little did either of them know that this brief encounter would set off a chain of events that would change their lives forever. The little boy hesitated for a moment before pulling his backpack closer to his chest. "I was waiting for my dad near the big bookstore," he said, his voice uncertain. "I thought I saw him across the street, so I ran after him, but it wasn't him." The homeless man nodded, taking in the boy's worried expression. He could see the panic creeping into the child's wide eyes, the fear of being stranded alone in an unfamiliar part of town. He had seen that look before, on people who had lost everything and had no idea what to do next. "What's your name, kid?" the man asked gently. "Leo," the boy replied. "Well, Leo, my name's Thomas," the homeless man said, offering a small smile. "And I think I know the bookstore you're talking about. It's a few blocks from here. If you'd like, I can walk you there." Leo hesitated again. His parents had always told him to be careful around strangers, but something about Thomas felt different. He didn't seem scary or dangerous, just tired and kind. "Okay," Leo said softly. As they started walking, Thomas kept his pace slow, making sure Leo felt safe. The streets were getting quieter as the evening wore on, and the neon signs of nearby shops flickered, casting colorful glows on the pavement. Thomas pulled his worn-out coat tighter around himself, his breath visible in the cold air. "What were you doing out here?" Leo asked after a moment, his small voice breaking the silence. Thomas chuckled, though there was no real humor in it. "Just watching the world go by," he said. "Thinking about things." Leo frowned, glancing up at him. "Do you have a home?" Thomas shook his head. "Not anymore, kid." Leo's small face scrunched up in confusion. "Then where do you sleep?" Thomas gestured vaguely. "Wherever I can. Sometimes at a shelter, sometimes out here." Leo fell silent, digesting that information. He couldn't imagine not having a warm bed to sleep in at night, a place to go where people cared about him. His dad always made sure he was safe. The idea that Thomas didn't have someone to take care of him made his chest feel tight. They walked past dimly lit alleys and bustling restaurants, where people laughed over steaming bowls of soup. The scent of fresh bread wafted through the air, making Thomas's stomach tighten with hunger. But he ignored it. Tonight, the most important thing was getting Leo back to his father. A few minutes later, they turned a corner, and the bright lights of the bookstore came into view. Thomas glanced down at Leo. "That the place?" Leo's face lit up with relief. "Yes, that's it." Thomas smiled. "All right, let's get you back to your dad." Neither of them noticed the sleek black car parked across the street, nor the man inside who had been searching frantically for his son. That man was about to step out of the car and change Thomas's life forever. Leo's small feet picked up speed as he ran toward the bookstore, his eyes scanning the crowd outside. "Dad," he called, his voice high with urgency. A tall man in an expensive black coat spun around at the sound of his son's voice. His worried expression melted into overwhelming relief as he spotted Leo rushing toward him. Leo, the man, Jonathan Carter, a wealthy businessman known for his sharp mind and ruthless efficiency, immediately crouched down and pulled his son into a tight embrace. "Where were you? I was so worried." His hands checked over Leo as if to make sure he was really there. Leo pointed behind him. "I got lost, but Thomas helped me." Jonathan's gaze shifted up, landing on Thomas, who stood a few feet away with his hands tucked into his worn-out coat pockets. His graying beard, tired eyes, and weathered clothes made it obvious that he was homeless. Jonathan straightened, his protective instincts flaring. "Who are you?" he asked, his tone sharp. Thomas raised his hands slightly, sensing the suspicion in the man's voice. "I'm nobody important. Just a guy who helped your son find his way back." Jonathan's eyes narrowed as he studied Thomas. He was used to dealing with all kinds of people, some genuine, some opportunistic. He'd built his fortune by knowing exactly who to trust and who to avoid. And yet, there was something in Thomas's eyes, something real. Leo tugged on his father's sleeve. "Dad, he's really nice. I was scared, but he walked with me and made sure I got back safe." Jonathan's expression softened slightly. He exhaled, nodding. "I see." Then, turning back to Thomas, he added, "Thank you for helping my son." Thomas simply nodded. "Glad he's safe." He turned slightly, ready to walk away. "Take care, kid." Leo's heart clenched as he saw Thomas retreating. "Wait," he called, running after him. He dug into his small backpack, pulling out a crumpled $5 bill. "Here, it's not a lot, but maybe you can get something warm to eat." Thomas looked down at the money, then at Leo's hopeful face. He hesitated before shaking his head. "That's real kind of you, kid, but you keep it. I'll be all right." Jonathan watched the interaction carefully. A homeless man refusing money? That wasn't something he saw every day. Leo frowned. But Jonathan placed a hand on his son's shoulder. "Come on, Leo. Let's go home." Leo reluctantly nodded and followed his father toward their car. But before getting in, Jonathan glanced back at Thomas one last time. Something about the man stuck with him. The way he carried himself, the quiet dignity in his stance. It was clear that he wasn't just another person down on his luck. There was a story there. As Jonathan drove away, he couldn't shake the image of Thomas standing alone under the streetlights. And he had a feeling this wouldn't be the last time their paths crossed. That night, Jonathan sat in his study, swirling a glass of whiskey as he stared at the city skyline through the massive glass windows of his penthouse. He had everything: a thriving business, a luxurious home, wealth beyond measure. But for some reason, he couldn't shake the image of Thomas standing in the cold, turning down money from his son. Most homeless people would have snatched the money without hesitation. So why didn't Thomas? Jonathan wasn't a man who ignored his instincts. When something didn't make sense, he had to find out why. With a sigh, he grabbed his phone and called his assistant, Mark. "Find out everything you can about a homeless man named Thomas. Mid-50s, graying beard, brown coat. Frequents the area around the Grand Bookstore." Mark, used to Jonathan's unusual requests, didn't ask questions. "I'll get back to you in the morning." The next afternoon, Jonathan was in his office when Mark walked in, holding a folder. "You were right. He's not just any homeless guy." Jonathan put down his pen. "Go on." Mark opened the file. "His full name is Thomas Grayson. He was once a successful professor of history at a prestigious university. Brilliant mind, well-respected, loved by his students. But about 10 years ago, his wife and daughter died in a car accident. After that, he fell apart, quit his job, lost his home. He tried getting back on his feet, but never quite managed. He's been living on the streets for years now." Jonathan leaned back in his chair, processing the information. "A professor," he murmured. "No wonder he carried himself differently." Mark hesitated before adding, "There's more. He never begs, never accepts handouts. People say he helps others when he can, even with nothing to his name." Jonathan tapped his fingers against the desk. He had met countless businessmen, investors, and CEOs, but Thomas intrigued him in a way none of them did. After a moment, he stood. "I want to see him again." Later that evening, Jonathan returned to the area where they had found Thomas the night before. The streets were busy, filled with people going about their lives, oblivious to those who had nothing. It took him some time, But eventually, he spotted Thomas sitting on a bench, reading a tattered old book under the glow of a street lamp. Jonathan approached, stopping a few feet away. "Mind some company?" Thomas glanced up, recognizing him instantly. He gave a small shrug. "Free country." Jonathan sat down. For a moment, neither spoke. Then Jonathan said, "You used to be a professor." Thomas tensed slightly, his fingers tightening around the book. "You looked me up." "I did," Jonathan admitted. "You were brilliant." "Still are, I'd imagine." Thomas exhaled through his nose, staring ahead. "That was a long time ago." Jonathan studied him. "You don't have to keep living like this, you know." Thomas chuckled, but there was no humor in it. "You think it's that simple?" He shook his head. "Once you fall, people stop seeing you. The world moves on. I've made my peace with it." Jonathan wasn't convinced. "If you had another chance, if someone offered you a way back, would you take it?" Thomas looked at him sharply. "Why are you asking?" "Because I think you deserve one," Jonathan said simply. For the first time, Thomas looked genuinely caught off guard. His eyes searched Jonathan's, trying to gauge if he was serious. But Jonathan wasn't one to say things he didn't mean. After a long silence, Thomas exhaled. "I don't know if I remember how to be anything else." Jonathan leaned forward. "Then let's find out." The next morning, Jonathan arranged for Thomas to meet him at a quiet cafe near his office. It was warm inside, a stark contrast to the cold streets outside. Thomas hesitated at the entrance, shifting uncomfortably in his worn-out coat, before finally stepping in. Jonathan was already seated at a corner table, a cup of black coffee in front of him. When he saw Thomas, he gestured to the chair opposite. "You made it." Thomas sat down cautiously. "Not every day a man like you offers a man like me a meeting in a place like this." Jonathan smirked. "I'm not offering you charity. I'm offering you an opportunity." Thomas arched an eyebrow. "What kind of opportunity?" Jonathan leaned forward. "I read about you, your work, your lectures. You had a sharp mind, a passion for history, and a gift for teaching. That doesn't just disappear because life threw you into hell." He took a sip of his coffee. "I want to help you get back on your feet." Thomas let out a slow breath, staring at his hands. "And what if I've been down too long?" Jonathan shrugged. "Then let's find out. I can set you up with a place to stay, help you get back into teaching. Maybe tutoring at first, then something bigger. But you have to be willing to take the first step." Thomas was silent for a long time, processing everything. Finally, he chuckled softly. "You're a stubborn man, Jonathan." Jonathan smirked. "It's why I'm successful." Thomas shook his head, but a small spark of something, hope, perhaps, glimmered in his eyes. "All right, I'll try." Jonathan didn't waste time. That very afternoon, he took Thomas to a small but comfortable apartment he had arranged. It was modest, but compared to the freezing streets, it felt like a palace. Thomas stood in the doorway, taking it all in. "I don't know what to say." "Say you'll make the most of it," Jonathan replied. "There are fresh clothes in the closet, food in the fridge. Get some rest. Tomorrow, we start." Thomas nodded, swallowing hard. "Thank you." Jonathan simply clapped him on the shoulder before leaving. The following days were an adjustment. At first, Thomas struggled. Having a roof over his head after so many years felt strange. He wasn't used to soft beds or warm meals, and sometimes he woke up in a panic, forgetting where he was. But Jonathan didn't let him slip back into old habits. He arranged for Thomas to visit a local community center, where he could start tutoring underprivileged kids in history. At first, Thomas was hesitant, unsure if he still had the skill. But the moment he stood in front of a small group of eager young minds, something clicked. He wasn't just surviving anymore. He was teaching again, and it felt right. One evening, after a long day of tutoring, Thomas sat across from Jonathan at a restaurant. His face was brighter, his posture stronger. "You were right," he admitted. "It's not easy, but I feel like myself again." Jonathan raised his glass. "Then let's keep going." For the first time in years, Thomas truly believed he had a future. Months passed, and Thomas's life transformed in ways he never imagined. The small tutoring job at the community center led to something bigger. Local schools took notice of his teaching skills, and soon, he was offered a part-time position at an adult education center. Teaching history to students who wanted a second chance at education gave him a sense of purpose he thought he had lost forever. One evening, Jonathan received a message from Thomas. "Can we meet? There's something I want to share with you." Curious, Jonathan agreed. They met at the same cafe where their journey had begun. This time, Thomas walked in looking entirely different. His old, tattered coat was replaced with a clean, well-fitted jacket. His face, once weary and lined with despair, now carried confidence and warmth. "I wanted to thank you," Thomas said as he sat down. "Not just for the apartment or the job, but for believing in me when I had stopped believing in myself." Jonathan smiled. "I just pointed you in the right direction. You did the hard work." Thomas chuckled. "Still, not many people would do what you did. You changed my life." Jonathan leaned back, thinking. "Funny thing is, you changed mine too." Thomas raised an eyebrow. "How so?" Jonathan exhaled, a rare moment of vulnerability crossing his face. "You reminded me that success isn't just about wealth. It's about the impact we have on others. I've spent years making deals, expanding my business, chasing numbers. But helping you? That felt like something real." Thomas nodded. "Sometimes, we all just need someone to point us in the right direction." They sat in silence for a moment, sipping their coffee, both men understanding that life had come full circle in the most unexpected way. A few weeks later, Thomas received something he never expected, a formal job offer from a prestigious private school, thanks to a recommendation Jonathan had made on his behalf. As he signed the contract, he thought back to the night he met Daniel, the lost little boy. That one small act of kindness had set off a chain of events that changed his life. And it all started with giving a child directions.